Before Wichita knew his name, before the letters, before the headlines, there was only silence. A silence Dennis Rader would later describe not as peace, but as pressure. For decades, that pressure built quietly inside a man who outwardly represented order, discipline, and moral certainty. A church leader, a husband, a father, a city employee tasked with enforcing rules. Yet behind this carefully constructed identity lived a fantasy world defined by domination, ritual, and control. This is not the story of a man who lost control. It is the story of a man who built his entire life around maintaining it. This is part 1 of Dennis Rader, Inside a Killer's Mind. To understand Rader, we must begin not with violence, but with structure. Born in 1945 in Wichita, Kansas, Dennis Rader grew up in a rigid, rule-bound household. His father was emotionally distant and authoritarian, emphasizing obedience, discipline, and self-control. Affection was limited. Emotional expression was discouraged. Mistakes were corrected, not explored. This environment taught Dennis a foundational lesson early in life. Order equals safety, and authority must be obeyed. The Rader home was a place of surfaces, of appearances. His father, a stoic and hard-working man, provided for the family financially, but was emotionally barricaded. Praise was non-existent. Approval was conveyed through a quiet absence of criticism. His mother, equally reserved, focused on maintaining a spotless home and a respectable public image. There were no family discussions about feelings, no hugs of reassurance, no room for the messy realities of emotional life. Young Dennis learned that what mattered was not what you felt, but what you did, and how it looked to the outside world. This created a profound emotional vacuum. With no outlet for his anxieties, frustrations, or burgeoning dark thoughts, he turned inward, creating a secret world where he was not the ignored, overlooked son, but a figure of immense power and importance. Even as a child, Rader exhibited disturbing curiosities. He later admitted to experiencing early arousal connected to images of restraint and helplessness, fantasies involving binding, immobilization, and absolute control. These fantasies were not fleeting. They were rehearsed, revisited, refined. Importantly, they were internal. Rader did not act out impulsively. He observed, he imagined, he planned. This distinction matters. Many violent offenders externalize distress early through aggression or defiance. Rader internalized. His fantasies became private rituals, mental spaces where he held power he lacked emotionally in real life. These internal rehearsals allowed the fantasies to mature without challenge, consequence, or interruption. To shield himself from the enormity of these thoughts, Rader developed a psychological construct he called Factor X. This was his name for the dark, powerful entity that lived within him, the force he claimed was responsible for his violent urges. Factor X was not just a metaphor, it was a fully formed alter ego. It was the predator, the monster, while Dennis Rader remained the compliant churchgoer and devoted family man. This dissociation was a critical defense mechanism. By blaming Factor X, Rader could abdicate responsibility for his own desires. He wasn't a monster, he was possessed by one. This allowed him to maintain his public facade without being crushed by the weight of his own darkness. He could, in his own mind, remain a good person who was simply afflicted with a terrible, powerful curse. The relationship was symbiotic. Rader saw himself not as the creator of Factor X, but as its servant. He described it as a constant, nagging presence, a voice in the back of his mind that grew louder and more insistent over time. During his prowling years, a successful break-in would quiet the voice, feeding the beast and buying him a period of calm. But the hunger always returned, stronger each time. Dennis Rader's job was to manage this hunger. He had to find appropriate targets, plan the logistics, and create the perfect conditions for Factor X to emerge. In this internal drama, Rader cast himself as the put-upon assistant to a powerful, demanding master. This dynamic allowed him to feel a sense of purpose and importance. He was the only one who understood the creature, the only one who could satisfy its needs. It was a terrifying, intimate partnership that defined his entire adult life. As adolescence gave way to adulthood, Rader learned something crucial. He could live two lives. Outwardly, he followed the script perfectly. He married, started a family, held steady employment, and embedded himself in community institutions. Inwardly, his fantasy life intensified. Sexual arousal became inseparable from domination and suffering. These were not intrusive thoughts, they were cultivated scenarios. Rader's sexuality was not driven by attraction in the conventional sense. It was driven by control. Victims were interchangeable components in a narrative he authored. What mattered was not who they were, but what they represented: submission, fear, stillness. This inner world demanded structure, and Rader supplied it. He documented fantasies, he created scripts, he assigned himself a name: BTK, bind, torture, kill. This was not bravado. It was taxonomy, a way of organizing desire into a system. Naming the fantasy made it real, tangible, operational. Before Rader ever killed, he rehearsed. For years, he engaged in what he termed projects, a chillingly sterile name for a campaign of systematic prowling and violation. This was the bridge from his internal world to the external one. Consider a typical night. Rader, working for the ADT security company, uses his knowledge to bypass a simple lock on a suburban home he's been observing for weeks. He knows the family is on vacation. Inside, the air is still and silent. This isn't a burglary for profit. It's a form of psychological immersion. He walks through the darkened rooms, touching their possessions, breathing in the scent of their lives. The real ritual begins in the master bedroom. He goes through drawers, finding lingerie, scarves, items that represent the female presence in the house. He might take a small trophy, an item he can later use to fuel his fantasies. Then, in the ultimate act of violation, he uses their own ropes or belts to bind himself, often in a closet or in front of a mirror, simulating the helplessness of a victim. For Rader, this was the crucible. It was here, alone, in the silent, occupied space of his future victims, that he tested his nerve, refined his methods, and solidified the link between violation, control, and intense arousal. He was pushing the boundary, seeing how far he could take the fantasy before it demanded a living, breathing participant. By January 1974, the pressure of Factor X and a decade of prowling had reached a boiling point. Rader selected his first targets, the Otero family. He didn't choose them out of rage or revenge, he chose them because they fit the fantasy. He stalked them for weeks, parking down the street, memorizing their comings and goings, feeling a sense of ownership and power with every detail he gathered. He later described this period as a golden time, the anticipation building to an almost unbearable peak. The night before the murders, he assembled his hit kit, a bag containing ropes, tape, a gun, and cloths. This was the final step, the physical manifestation of years of planning. Each item in the bag was a prop for the grand play he was about to stage, a play that, until now, had only ever been performed in his mind. On the morning of January 15th, 1974, Rader entered the Otero home. He was calm, methodical, a man executing a plan. He told the family he was a wanted fugitive and just needed a place to hide out. But the fantasy quickly collided with a messy, terrifying reality. The victims didn't behave as they did in his scripts. They were terrified, unpredictable. The neat, orderly scene he had imagined dissolved into chaos. Yet, through it all, Rader felt the intoxicating surge of Factor X, a feeling of ultimate power as he enacted his darkest desires. When it was over, he drove away, not with panic, but with a profound sense of accomplishment. He had done it. He had brought his internal world into reality. He took a watch from the home, his first trophy, and then, in the most chilling act of all, he went about his day, the perfect portrait of normalcy, the monster hidden once more behind the mask. That evening, Dennis Rader walked through the front door of his own home. His wife greeted him, asked about his day. He responded with mundane details, the mask of normalcy perfectly in place, but inside, the monster was still roaring. After dinner, he retreated to his basement. He took out the watch he had stolen from the Otero home and placed it in a small, locked box, his trophy case. Then he opened a fresh notebook. At the top of the page, he wrote, "The Otero Project." With the dispassionate precision of a lab technician, he began to document everything: the layout of the house, the names of the victims, the methods he used. This was his cooling down period. The act of writing drained the manic energy of Factor X, transforming the chaotic, bloody reality into a neat, orderly narrative. He was no longer just a participant. He was the historian, the archivist of his own evil. By bottling the experience in ink, he could preserve the feeling of power, ready to be uncorked and savored whenever the pressure began to build again. Days turned into a week, and the Otero murders became the biggest news story in Wichita. The city was gripped by fear and disbelief, and Dennis Rader, family man and ADT employee, was a silent observer of the chaos he had authored. Imagine him in his living room, a newspaper spread out on his lap, his wife talking with concern about the news. He nods, feigns shock, perhaps even offers a word of condemnation. But internally, he is soaring. He watches the police chief on the evening news, assuring the public that they have leads, that they are working around the clock. Rader scoffs. He sees the reporters speculating wildly, getting the details wrong. He feels a profound sense of contempt for them all. They are actors in his play, and they don't even know it. This was the ultimate expression of his power. Not just the act of killing, but the act of secretly controlling the emotional landscape of an entire city. He was a god in his own universe, hiding in plain sight, the only one who knew the truth. After the murders, Rader did something critical. He documented them. Photographs, written descriptions, trophies. These were not souvenirs in the traditional sense. They were anchors, tools to preserve the emotional state of dominance and replay it indefinitely. Memory became ritual. Equally important was communication. The BTK letters were not attempts to avoid capture. They were assertions of authorship. Rader wanted recognition, not as a criminal, but as a superior intellect. He corrected police narratives. He critiqued media coverage. He positioned himself as director rather than subject. This reveals the narcissistic core of his psychology. Rader did not merely want to commit crimes. He wanted them understood, on his terms. The letters were instruments of control, extending his reach beyond the crime scene into public consciousness. 3 years later, in December of 1977, Rader would refine his methodology. His target was Nancy Fox, a 25-year-old woman he had stalked. The Otero murders had been chaotic, a messy explosion of a long-suppressed fantasy. The murder of Nancy Fox, however, was different. It was cleaner, more controlled. He broke into her apartment, waited for her, and executed his fantasy with a chilling precision. He had learned from his first outing, and this time, the crime adhered more closely to the script in his mind. But the most significant evolution was what he did next. After the murder, Rader drove to a payphone. With adrenaline still coursing through him, he calmly dialed 911. He reported a homicide at Nancy Fox's address, then hung up and disappeared back into the night. This was a supreme act of arrogance, a new level of engagement. He wasn't just a killer, he was a puppeteer, directly manipulating the law enforcement officers who were hunting him, proving he could touch them, speak to them, and still remain a ghost. This evolution from a mere killer to a media-savvy monster culminated in his next communication. He sent a chilling, handwritten poem to a local television station, a parody of the lyrics to a folk song titled "Oh Death." He called his version, "Oh, Death to Nancy." The poem was a grotesque celebration of his crime, filled with taunts and boasts. This was a profound escalation. He was no longer just claiming his work. He was mythologizing it. The poem was an act of branding, an attempt to build a terrifying public persona. It revealed a man who was not just a slave to his violent compulsions, but one who was actively reveling in the terror he created. He saw himself as a dark artist, a writer of nightmares, and he wanted the entire city of Wichita to be his captive audience. What allowed this to continue for decades was not brilliance, but alignment. Rader's need for order mirrored his public roles. As a compliance officer, he enforced rules. As a church leader, he preached morality. These roles were not contradictions. They were reinforcements. They validated his self-image as an authority figure. Compartmentalization was the mechanism that made this possible. One psychological compartment housed family, work, and faith. Another housed fantasy, violence, and ritual. These compartments rarely intersected until they did. By the early 1990s, Rader's crimes paused. This was not remorse. It was management. His life had become crowded with responsibilities. The fantasy did not disappear. It went dormant, preserved through documentation and memory. The pressure, however, never left. When he resumed communication in the early 2000s, it was not necessity. It was ego. Technology had changed. So had his confidence. Rader believed he could reinsert himself into the narrative without consequence. This belief would prove fatal to his freedom. In Part 1, we have constructed the foundation of Dennis Rader's psychology, a man driven by ritualized fantasy, sustained by compartmentalization, and fueled by a need for recognition and control. He was not impulsive. He was deliberate. Not chaotic, but structured. Not hidden, but embedded. In Part 2, we will examine how this system unraveled, how ego undermined caution, how technology pierced anonymity, and how the man who built his identity around control lost it completely. Join us next time as we complete the psychological dissection of BTK and witness the collapse of a carefully engineered double life.